Yes, my name is Bruce Y. Lee. I'm a professor of health policy and management at the City University of New York, School of Public Health. I'm also a senior contributor for Forbes.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lee, we're recording this conversation, if that's okay with you, for WPKN News. Obviously, we've been talking nonstop for the last few months about this virus, about its impact, about the future, about how it happened. There's a lot of information out there, and it's digested by different people differently, sometimes to support however they feel. I'm hoping that you can join us here on air to maybe peel away some of the confusion and look at this without that political lens that so many people look at this through. Dr. Lee, 3 months ago, we had on a holistic doctor out of Bedford, New York, who suggested that this was coming. There was not much at that point we were going to be able to do about it. And his advice to listeners, WPKN News, was to start beefing up your immune system, get rid of things in your lifestyle that would not help fight a virus, let alone the coronavirus. For instance, if you smoke, stop smoking. If you eat poorly, change those habits. If you're not getting enough sleep, start getting sleep. Is that good advice? Is that still good advice?
Well, certainly maintaining a healthy lifestyle is important. So getting enough sleep and eating well, getting enough exercise, those are important in general. And so that's reasonable. Now, there is talk of, specific things to boost your immune system. Those can be questionable. People have argued taking supplements and things like that. So certainly a healthy lifestyle is reasonable. I should add, though, that there are things that you can do to avoid the virus, and, these are the social distancing measures, as well as washing your hands frequently and thoroughly, and, actively disinfecting objects and things like that. So people shouldn't feel like they can't do anything. You can actually do things to try to avoid infections from the virus. There's no vaccine or no specific treatment right now, but you can do different things.
And it's, listen, the vaccine is something that people are holding out hope for. What are the realities? What should we temper our expectations?
Yeah, the reality is it takes time to develop a vaccine. So vaccines go through a significant amount of development and testing. So, the vaccines that are currently available for other types of diseases have undergone a lot of testing, and people want to make extra sure that a vaccine is safe because you're giving it to potentially healthy people. So expecting a vaccine to appear overnight is not reasonable. And there's been talks, certainly it's going to take more than a year. Some people have said, well, maybe 12 to 18 months. That's a very optimistic timeline. Some people have said, at least 2 years or more than that. It's really hard to tell because once you develop a candidate vaccine, it has to go through testing. So you have to put it through testing, through animal testing, and eventually testing through humans, and all sorts of things can happen in terms of that. So I think the most optimistic timeline people are talking about is between 12 and 18 months, but we can't be sure how long it will take.
So when you say all sorts of things can happen, you mean to delay progress or to maybe
you basically
change the course of the vaccine?
Yeah, you basically have to see if the vaccine, you have to check several things. So one is, can the vaccine actually elicit some type of immune response from your immune system? So that's the first thing. And is that a protective immune response? So some vaccines they find, or some vaccine candidates they may find, it can't even generate an immune response. So those, even though they look promising, won't work out. And then some vaccines may be able to generate some type of response, but it's not enough of a response to actually be protective. So you have to test the vaccine to see if it actually can protect a person against the virus. And so that's the side of making sure the vaccine actually works. And then, of course, the third thing with making sure the vaccine works is you want to make sure that the protection extends enough. So it's not enough to generate protection for a few days because you don't want to be taking something every several days. How long will that response last? So testing for those things. And on the flip side, you want to make sure the vaccine is safe. So they have to proceed cautiously and make sure that the vaccine doesn't have significant side effects that are at an unacceptable level. And you also want to make sure that if you stimulate the immune system, you don't overstimulate the immune system, where you might have a situation where you have other problems as a result. So all of this takes time to actually figure out, and there's no way of figuring it out without actually testing it. And as we all know, like once you go into testing, all sorts of things can happen. You can find things, unexpected effects and things like that. So the scientists have to be very careful about that. So that takes time.
Makes sense. It does. And you mentioned overstimulating the immune system. There's something I've read about now a couple of times, and correct my pronunciation on this, cytokine storm?
Cytokine storm, yep.
What is the significance of that? It seems to be that particular event, that phenomena, is at the heart of the people who've been hit the hardest?
Yes, that's definitely one of the mechanisms. So the problem is our immune systems are not used to this virus. So if you talk about the flu and some other viruses, at least our immune systems have been exposed to those viruses either through vaccination or through getting sick or exposed to those viruses. But this is a completely new virus. So the immune system does not know how to really react. And one challenge is that sometimes the immune system will overreact. So because there's not a specific immune response to this virus. So the immune system will sit there and say, okay, something's wrong. There's an invader. Let's generate an immune response. And part of that is generating this cascade of chemicals within your body that then do all sorts of things. Like it might make your blood vessels more leaky so that in theory, the other immune cells can then move closer or find the viruses. But the trouble is when you have those type of chemicals in abundance and all over the place, then you can create all kinds of problems with your body. So your body then starts having trouble maintaining proper blood pressure. So your blood pressure may drop, and your body may have problems providing enough blood to all the different organs. So what you see is this cascade of things. You may have the cytokine storm, and then you may go into what's called sepsis or septic shock, where your body just starts shutting down. You start losing the ability to maintain proper blood flow and proper blood pressure, and then you start experiencing organ failure. So different aspects of your organs start failing. And that's when you're really in trouble, and a lot of those people may not survive. So it's a big problem.
Is the issue that it's hard to recognize once this event is occurring, and that's part A of this question. Part B, once a physician recognizes that's what's occurring, is there any way to stop it or to slow it?
Yeah, there's several problems. So one is this can happen very quickly and unexpectedly. There may not be too many signs before it's happening because it's all within the body. I mean, you may feel fever and feel weak and fatigued, but there are many situations where people progress into sepsis and septic shock very rapidly. So there isn't that much time to burn until you actually have to try to do something. And the second issue, which you alluded to, is most of the treatment of sepsis, a lot of the treatment of sepsis is support. So you want to try to support the body. Hopefully the body can recover. So if the blood pressure is dropping, then you provide medications, you provide fluids to try to maintain the blood pressure. And if some of the organs start failing, you try to do things to support the organs. So a lot of the treatment is what we call supportive care, meaning that you don't actually treat the cause of what's going on. You try to treat the symptoms and try to get the person through the storm.
I looked at one of your Forbes articles recently, and in your column you listed some of the new warning signs, I guess, of this particular COVID-19. What are some of the ones that we may not be familiar with or may not seem logical?
Yeah, so this is very challenging because it started off, there was that triad of symptoms, fever, cough, and respiratory symptoms, shortness of breath. So people were looking for that. But as more and more people have gotten this infection, we're hearing more and more stories and seeing more and more case reports of people having more unusual symptoms or greater breadth of different types of symptoms. So certainly things like fatigue or headaches, And as you know, these headaches, fatigue are very nonspecific. I mean, you can have headaches for many different reasons, and same thing with fatigue or muscle aches. And even with the new CDC list of symptoms, they added 6 more symptoms to the original 3 symptoms. That's not exhaustive. So there are symptoms that are coming out. So diarrhea is one of those added symptoms, but there are other things like some people are having some eye symptoms or skin symptoms, or there's reports of people just not feeling right or feeling anxious. So we're seeing a really wide range of different possibilities, which means that you can't diagnose the infections by symptoms alone. It's different from something like chickenpox or measles, where there's a characteristic rash, or you see the different vesicles in your arms and legs and body. There's not that characteristic symptom. So the trouble is, you really need to have testing to be sure if you actually have the infection. So some people may not even realize. They might think they just have a headache and just don't feel right, and they could be infected, and they could be infectious as well.
And obviously, expanding testing has been, a lead story now for months, and depending on who you talk to, we're doing a great job, or we're falling way short on this. But are we somewhere in the middle?
Well, there's many situations or stories of people not getting testing and not having testing readily available. The only way we can really take on this virus or try to combat this virus is to know where it is. So we have to know, who's been infected, who's currently infectious, who has recovered from the infection and is now potentially immune. So there's 2 types of testing. So one is looking for the virus during an active infection, and the other is checking for antibodies, which is evidence that you've been exposed or infected with the virus previously. So neither of those are widely available yet. The testing has increased, but there's still many people reporting that they can't get the tests, especially the test for the live virus, as soon as they'd like, because that should be readily available, number one, and it should be readily available to everyone. So you shouldn't be in a situation where you need to have a certain amount of money or a certain amount of clout to get tested. It should be available to everyone, because we really need to know where the virus is going. The virus is not going to select certain groups of people to infect. And then the same thing is with the serologies. Those things need to be widely available. So I think it's pretty clear that we are far from where we need to be when it comes to testing.
We're speaking with Dr. Bruce Lee, Professor of Health Policy and Management, City University of New York, Executive Director of Public Health, Computational and Operations Research, and a senior contributor to Forbes. Dr. Lee, I'm going to ask you 3 big questions now. Question number 1, is there one theory or one practice that seems to make more sense as far as how we handle this virus? Shutter in place like we are doing, or say in Scandinavia where people are leaning more towards herd immunity?
So the concerns about the herd immunity strategies is that you basically are allowing people to be infected with this virus and to get to a point where enough people have been infected so that the virus has trouble finding more people to infect. And that percentage may be somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population. Now, that's fraught with a lot of problems. So first of all, when people get infected, as can be clearly seen, there are a number of people who don't do well. So they require hospitalization, they get sick, and they may not survive. So there's the risk of people dying or people getting very sick as a result. Secondly, there's significant cost to that, because these hospitalizations and this medical care costs money. We recently published a study which showed, it was published in the journal Health Affairs, which showed the significant cost that's associated with COVID-19 infections. And, in the United States, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. So you have tremendous cost. And the last problem is science hasn't yet confirmed that you can't get reinfected with the virus. So there are reports of people in various places. There are reports out of China, out of Japan, of people potentially getting reinfected with the virus. Now, it's not clear whether these are faults of the test or people were actually got reinfected. So there are situations in which people tested positive and then they tested negative, and then later on they tested positive again. So in theory, it could be the negative test could be a false negative. But the WHO, World Health Organization, has announced very clearly that they can't be sure if an immunity is conferred if you get infected, and that you can't get infected later. So that's another big risk of the herd immunity strategy, because what happens if people get reinfected again? So that's why a lot of other countries, besides Sweden, I know the UK was considering it, but a lot of countries have realized that there needs to be some combination of social distancing. But there's actually a wide range of different types of social distancing approaches. So as we've seen, some countries have been on the more severe end, like significant lockdown, shelter in place, stay-at-home orders, and then other countries have had variations of it where they've had social distancing, but it was not complete. And the reason you can potentially do that is there are other things that you can do along with the social distancing. So very aggressive testing and tracing and isolation and quarantine. So people talk about test, trace, isolate, or quarantine, which basically means you'll identify cases as quickly as possible, figure out all the contacts that they may have had, who they might have contacted, and isolate and quarantine them as quickly as possible so that you're containing the virus. If you can get that strategy in place, that's what allows you to be a little more relaxed in terms of social distancing, because you're trying to catch the virus and contain the virus before it spreads around. Otherwise, you have to do more aggressive social distancing because there's no other way to really stop the spread of the virus.
We heard out of Moscow months ago that they were able to keep numbers low comparatively through aggressive tracing. And I thought to myself, boy, that seems like a Herculean task, though, doesn't it?
Certainly. It's a challenging operation. So in theory, the concept is straightforward, right? You basically just try to identify everyone who has an active infection and then try to identify their contacts. But if you think about it, first of all, people may not remember who they came into contact with. You ask people, sometimes you can't even remember what you just ate, an hour ago, or who you talked to just an hour ago. Imagine over the entire course of your potential infectiousness, trying to recall who you had contact with. And the trouble with this COVID-19 coronavirus is it's highly contagious. So it's not necessarily really close contact. What happens if you cross a stranger in the grocery store and you got too close and you touched the same things? How do you figure out who that stranger is, and how do I identify that person? So contact tracing requires large armies of people to basically do all these things, to interview people, to figure out who they contacted, to try to track down the potential contacts and convince them to isolate or quarantine themselves. So it's a very labor-intensive process.
But important one. And
yes.
I'm really hoping that we can figure out an effective way of doing this. Dr. Lee, question number 2 of my big 3 questions. How did this happen?
So people have been warning, that anyone within the community, and that includes myself, have been warning about a pandemic. The question wasn't if, but when, because we've seen repeatedly situations in which microbes and often viruses can jump from an animal to humans. So, and we've seen mutations of existing viruses, et cetera. So we've already seen the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak. We've had the 2009 H1N1 flu pandemic. We've seen the Ebola outbreaks. We've seen the Zika outbreaks. There's been concerns about other types of flu, like avian flu. So this is not a surprise. No one within the infectious disease epidemics community was surprised by this happening, because we knew that it would happen at some point. Bill Gates, on multiple occasions, has given warnings that ago, we need to be more prepared for a pandemic. Because the problem is there's a number of trends that have been pushing towards this jumping of microbes from animals to humans. I mean, it's occurred throughout history, but it's more and more possible in recent years because, we have extensive travel among the different countries. There's a lot of trade among the different countries. We are moving into different environments and changing the environments of animals, which then in turn change their dynamics. And then there's also climate change, which is driving a lot of changes in what's happening with the animals and viruses, et cetera. So the challenge is this may not be, certainly it's not going to be the last pandemic. There are going to be other pandemics and other epidemics and outbreaks, and they could even be worse in the future. So we have to figure out how best to put in surveillance systems to track situations where viruses jump to humans and try to contain them as quickly as possible. And we have to better understand the things that may be pushing some of these microbes to be jumping. So a lot of the studies have suggested that this coronavirus is extremely similar to coronaviruses that have been circulating in the bat population. So the thought is there was some type of intermediary animal that the virus jumped from bat to that intermediary animal and then to humans. So, the question is whether they occurred at the wet markets in Wuhan, China. It's not clear exactly the point where that jumping occurred. But the fact that this happened is just not a surprise, and it's something that happens all the time. Many times it just doesn't go into become a pandemic, but we have to expect that to happen in the future.
I want to talk more in the future. I'd like to invite you back before we even conclude this interview to talk more about the climate change aspect of this, because I think that begs much more time than we have right now left in this interview. As far as the origination of this particular strain of the coronavirus, we've had people from PETA on the air. They've long warned about these wet markets, not only just as a place where, listen, it's cruel. It's hard to watch if you're a Western, if you're, of a Western frame of mind. It's hard to watch a dog being sold, for consumption. But even removing emotion and politics, these do seem like unsanitary and dangerous conditions, don't they?
Yeah, certainly you want to minimize situations where you could have unsanitary or unhygienic exposures. And there are situations around the world where that's the case, where it can promote the jumping of or make it easier for microbes to jump to humans. We hear all the time about animal-driven outbreaks of bacteria and other types of microbes. So that happens all the time. We see outbreaks in the United States as well, and those are not, many times that can occur under situations which are not unsanitary. So, if you have a situation like a wet market where you aren't maintaining proper hygiene, you're having situations where there may be exposures, that's not good for the control of infectious diseases.
Dr. Lee, we just very briefly on the domesticated animal front, big news today, obviously. People are very concerned about their pets. Cats seem to be able to contract the virus. I don't know if they could spread it. Any thoughts on domesticated cats, dogs, things like that, and their relation to this virus?
Yeah, there's been those cases of cats testing positive, the pug testing positive. There was also that case of a tiger potentially getting the infection. So, we have to keep in mind that we don't know enough about this virus, and we do know that most likely the virus did originate in the bat population or some type of or crossover to different potential animal populations. So we can't rule out the possibility that it can infect cats or dogs or other types of pets. So we have to be careful because we're still learning more and more about this virus. So we shouldn't assume that our pets are going to be safe or that they're not going to transmit the virus themselves. There just hasn't been enough studies. And that's a continuing challenge with this COVID-19 coronavirus, the science is trying to catch up with the situation. So you have to rapidly do these studies to figure out what's happening. And in many cases, there isn't the rapid funding to support these studies. So we really need a situation where there's an influx of capital to support scientific studies that can be done rapidly and then disseminated rapidly, because there's so many things that we need to learn about this virus, and animal transmission is one of them.
Dr. Lee, where before we ask our final question here, where can our listeners learn more about the work that you do? I personally signed up for your weekly Forbes column. How can our listeners do that?
Yeah, certainly they can sign up for my Forbes page and column, and follow me on Twitter at Bruce_Y_Lee. Certainly. So I write extensively for the general media. We also do research studies. So we, as I mentioned, we recently came out with a study in the journal Health Affairs that estimated the medical costs associated with COVID-19. So it's both on the writing side as well as the study side. For the past 15 years or so, our team has been building and running computer models, simulation models, to help decision makers better prevent and control infectious diseases. So, for instance, during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, our team was embedded in Health and Human Services to help with the national response. So the best ways are to go to my Forbes page, follow me on Twitter.
Why was it's so funny, you just brought up something, and I just had a memory triggered. I was sitting in the newsroom at WGCH Radio in Greenwich, Connecticut, and my physician called me during the H1N1. That was the swine flu?
Yes.
He called me during the uproar about the swine flu and said, hey, get down here quick, I have the vaccine, and I went down and I got vaccinated for it. Why did we have a vaccine for the swine flu on the ready?
So a big difference is the H1N1 flu virus was a new strain of flu. So the influenza virus we're very familiar with, and you have the influenza. Each year you have a different strain of the flu virus circulating. This was a completely new novel strain, but it was still the flu virus. So it's a lot easier to develop a vaccine more quickly when you already have a vaccine for the same type of organism. It's just a different strain. So it's just a matter of isolating this particular strain and then putting it into the vaccine, and it's doing the safety checks just to make sure that it passes all the safety tests. The difference here is we don't have a vaccine for different types of coronaviruses. After the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak, there were attempts to create a SARS vaccine, and there were groups that were working on that, but they couldn't they had trouble finding funding, because once the outbreak passed, people became less interested in it. So we would have been in a very different situation right now if, for the past 15 years, people had been working on a SARS vaccine. It might have been a lot easier to more rapidly develop a vaccine for this virus, which is labeled a SARS coronavirus 2 vaccine, because it's very similar to the original SARS. So this emphasizes the importance of continuing research, even though a particular microbe may not be an immediate threat, because you never know in the future. And that's one big problem with our current society, is that we wait until things happen and then we react. Instead, we need to be more proactive and say, okay, what are the different types of viruses that could potentially jump, and can we start developing vaccines for them before we actually have to worry about them?
I hear the conspiracy theorists clamoring already. It's human nature, I guess, to want to embrace some kind of a conspiracy rather than just the reality, which is, like you said, we weren't proactive enough. Dr. Lee, our final question here, and again, I want to thank you so much for your time and invite you back already for a future visit. But we're talking about a month from now, getting haircuts, going to the salon, going back to the supermarkets, in mass. What are the realities of reopening? And please, I'm so tired of hearing the light switch analogy. Tell us, what are the real realities of it? Is it dangerous for me to go get my hair cut?
Yeah, we have to keep in mind that the key is the virus still circulating in the community? If it's still circulating in the community, it still can continue to infect people, and it can still transmit at a rapid rate. So if we do the math, we have a single person, the R0, which is the reproductive rate for this virus, is estimated to be somewhere between 2 and 5. So that means every person that is infectious on average will infect 2 to 5 more people. You can see, if you do the math, how rapidly the virus could then spread. So if it's still circulating around the community, then reopening, all the businesses puts people at risk. So that's why you really can't reopen businesses until you have other measures in place to try to contain the virus. That's why test, trace, and isolate/quarantine is so important. Because if you think about it, how are you going to actually contain the virus? And that's why widespread testing is so important. How else are you going to know where the virus is spreading? So that's the challenge, because you can't just push to reopen without putting things in place to make sure the virus is caught or contained as quickly as possible. And that's the problem. I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, this is absolutely an economic hardship for many people. It's certainly a problem. It's not easy. It's not easy mentally and emotionally to social distance and not have your routine. A lot of people are suffering from this. These are real problems. So completely understand why people would like society to be reopened. But we have to keep in mind the virus is still circulating, so you can't push to reopen without other things in place. Because otherwise, we not only risk going back to where we were, we risk to making things even worse. So our modeling studies have shown that if you rapidly reopen places and then suddenly you have all these people who are now susceptible to getting infected, that could be like throwing logs into a fire. And you can actually have a huge surge in terms of infections. So we really have to figure out what's happening with the virus, and we can't do that without more widespread testing. There's really no other way to do that. And we have to be talking in a systematic way. We have to have the strategies in place. Otherwise, it's like running out to a football field and you have no plan. And you can't even see the field, and you can't even see all the other opponents. I mean, everyone would agree that that's a losing proposition. You really risk not only losing, but getting injured if you do that. It's the same situation here.
Is another month enough time? Is that a realistic time frame?
Yeah, the big question is how quickly can testing be ramped up? How quickly can all these contact tracing programs be ramped up? That's the challenging thing with a lot of the talk. The talk is more about that and less about I was trying to speculate what might happen with the virus. You really need those systems in place. So we really should be focusing on getting those things ramped up. The talk should be how quickly can we let's have a specific timeline. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. What percentage of the population are we going to be testing? What specific aspects of the population are we going to be testing? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. How many contact tracers do we have out there? How many of them are actually going around and doing contact tracing? What are our capabilities in terms of isolating folks? Those are the things that are really going to drive how quickly we can reopen. If you do that sooner, you can potentially reopen sooner. And that's where a lot of the talk should be focused on.
BruceYLee.com is your website.
Mm-hmm.
Any Twitter handle, anything that we want to look for on social media?
Yes. My handle is at Bruce_Y_Lee. That's Twitter. It's also my handle for Instagram as well, but I communicate quite regularly on Twitter, and yes, you mentioned the website, BruceYLee.com.
I want to thank Nancy May, our mutual friend of the board's best podcast, for introducing us. Well, I really appreciate your time, Dr. Lee, and I hope to have you back soon.
Happy to be here, and I enjoyed the conversation.